No one expected me to come. That alone should have told me everything. The door opened, and for a moment, no one spoke. Just the sound of the piano music from the living room, and the soft clink of someone stirring a drink in the kitchen. Then, surprise, forced and theatrical. My daughter-in-law's laugh was the first thing I heard. Light and unkind. My son came next, stepping around her like I was a piece of furniture someone had left out of place. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We didn't think you'd make it," he said. I stood there, coat still buttoned, the gift bag trembling slightly in my hand. "Oh, my daughter," his sister said, blinking with polite confusion. "You didn't say you were coming." Her voice was soft, sharp around the edges. She gestured vaguely to the hallway. "You can hang your coat in the guest bath." I nodded. I didn't smile. In the living room, the lights on the tree blinked with a cheer that felt almost mocking. Someone raised a glass and laughed, too loud, too long. No one looked my way again. I walked in slowly. Each step quiet. Each breath measured. I didn't feel anger. I felt something worse. I felt like I had walked into a house that used to be mine, but was no longer mine to enter. And I knew, even before I handed out the envelopes, before I said a single word more. This would be the last time I saw any of them like this. I found an empty spot at the far end of the table, half set, missing silverware, like someone had cleared it in a hurry and forgotten to finish the job. A red taper candle had burned all the way down to the glass. Wax had puddled across the runner like it was trying to escape. I hung my coat carefully over the back of the chair. Wool. Dark navy. Bought years ago for Frank's memorial service and worn only on rare, formal holidays since. I had pressed it that morning, even though no one would notice. There's dignity in preparation. Even if no one sees it. I could hear them moving around in the kitchen. Wine glasses clinking. A low murmur of conversation. The tap of heels on tile. I sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, pretending to study the garland draped along the window frame. Red ribbon, slightly frayed. Pine cones hot glued in place. I had made it, years ago, when the girls were still in grade school and the house was filled with craft paper and glue sticks and crooked ornaments. No one had mentioned that. Just kept it up, like a placeholder from another life. I wasn't asked if I wanted cider or coffee. No one inquired if I was hungry or cold. No one asked why I had come. And I realized, slowly and without drama, that they hadn't left a place for me. Not at the table. Not in the room. Not in the narrative. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel sadness, not in the way people expect, big and crashing and operatic. No, it was something quieter. A breath held too long. A shift in the chest. I had built a life out of small things. Not declarations. Not expectations. Just presence. Every birthday cake, every science fair board, every emergency trip to the school nurse, I had been there. I had driven through snowstorms, changed wet sheets at 2 a.m., sewed angel wings onto polyester costumes the night before the school play. I had sat through hours of soccer games in folding chairs that pinched the backs of my thighs and never once asked to be thanked. I had fed them. Not just meals. I had fed them memory, and story, and safety. 1,000 unremarkable gestures that, together, made a childhood. I had no photos on the walls. My name was not stitched into stockings. But I was the one who had kept this family from breaking apart when Frank's first wife left him shattered and ashamed. I was the one who taught them how to braid hair, tie shoes, fold towels the way hotels did it. I taught them how to sit with grief and make it something you could carry. I loved them. Not as a performance. Not as a strategy. But as a choice. And I made that choice every day, even when they didn't. Even when they rolled their eyes at my stories, or whispered in the hallway about getting her settled soon, or let months pass between phone calls, I loved them. That kind of love is not weak. It doesn't beg. It doesn't bargain. It just is. But it was never reciprocated. Not truly. I had started to notice it slowly. The first time I was excluded from a family photo, "Oh, just the siblings for this one," they'd said. Then, "Let's get one with just the kids and their spouses." Then, "Just the grandkids." Always just. Always more of me left out. Once, when a neighbor came by during a birthday party, I heard Frank's youngest say, "She's kind of like our stepmom. But she's been around forever. Like mildew. Like wallpaper. Not someone you celebrate. Just someone you accept until you repaint." Frank never saw it. Or maybe he did, and didn't know how to name it. He was kind in that quiet, Midwestern way, polite apologies and long silences. He held my hand in church. He made me tea when I was tired. But he never challenged the way they treated me. He never said, "That's your mother, show some respect." He just let things settle where they fell. And when he got sick, I cared for him. Bathed him. Read to him. Slept on the chair beside his bed. I called the hospice nurse. I kept the house clean for visitors. I shielded the kids from the worst of it. I told them, "Go, get rest," when I hadn't slept in 3 days. He died in my arms. They grieved loudly at the funeral, showy tears, long speeches. My grief was quiet. I sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief with my initials embroidered on it, and listened to them list his virtues. His strength, his dedication, his fatherhood. No one mentioned his marriage. No one said my name. Afterward, they came to the house like a storm. Cleared closets. Claimed keepsakes. Divided heirlooms like spoils. I had to remind them, gently, then firmly, that Frank had named me executor. That he had trusted me to carry out his wishes. That I was not just the woman in the background, but the woman he had chosen to build a life with. They didn't argue, exactly. But they stiffened. They nodded tightly. They left early. And that was the beginning of the end. The holidays changed after that. Fewer invitations. More text messages. The group thread that once pinged daily fell quiet. I sent a tin of cookies one Christmas and got a thank you from only one grandchild, typed by his mother, I'm sure. Still, I stayed kind. I kept my dignity like a pressed napkin, folded and clean. But this year was different. This year, I had learned things. It started with a bank error. A small withdrawal from the trust Frank had set up for the grandkids, unexplained. Then a second. I asked questions. The answers were vague. The paperwork didn't match what Frank and I had drawn up together. I didn't accuse. I asked again. More confusion. I started making copies. I kept a notebook. I made a call to our lawyer. Then another. I visited the bank in person. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became. They had moved on not just from me, but around me. I was no longer a participant in the family. I was a hurdle. An inconvenience. A resource. And resources, as I was beginning to understand, are meant to be managed. Redirected. Quietly phased out. So I did what I had always done. I observed. I noted. I made plans. I was done asking to be seen. They would see me, yes, but on my terms. And it began with showing up, uninvited, to their perfect little Christmas. With a gift. Wrapped in truth. It started, as most betrayals do, with something small. A detail. A slip. The letter from the bank came on a Thursday. I remember because it was the same day I had watered the porch plants and noticed the rosemary had started to brown. A white envelope, nothing urgent in the markings, just a routine update, it said. Inside, a note, as requested, changes have been made to the Educational Trust Fund. But I hadn't requested anything. I called the bank. A polite young man placed me on hold, transferred me twice, and then told me, calmly and confidently, that the request had come from my assigned financial proxy. I don't have a proxy, I said. He hesitated. Then asked if perhaps I had forgotten appointing someone. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of Frank's old filing cabinet. The papers were still in their folders, our wills, the trust paperwork, old tax filings. I laid them out on the dining table and went through them line by line, as I had done the year Frank passed. Nothing matched. The trust had been altered. Language I didn't remember. Dates that didn't align. I didn't panic. I made tea. I sat down and wrote a name in my notebook, Miriam Blass. Our estate lawyer from years ago. A woman I trusted. She agreed to meet me the next day. Her office hadn't changed. Still smelled faintly of lemon polish and cold air. She looked over the documents I brought. Her face was calm, but I could see it in her eyes, something wasn't right. These aren't your signatures, she said quietly. I stared at the page. It looked like my writing. But it wasn't. And the second witness signature. Laura. My stepdaughter. I asked her to keep it quiet. I needed time. Time to think. Time to understand what, exactly, had been taken from me. Because it wasn't just money. Over the following weeks, I started watching more closely. I stopped assuming. I asked quiet questions at Thanksgiving, nothing direct, just mentions. The way Owen answered told me more than any paperwork. He was too casual. Too confident. Kala, the private investigator, came recommended by Miriam. Late 50s, discreet, direct. She wore her hair pulled back and carried herself like someone who'd never once doubted her own voice. I gave her everything I had, bank statements, names, a timeline. 2 weeks later, she brought me a file. I read it alone in the study. Owen had digitally copied my signature, lifted from an old check, and used it to authorize access to the trust. Laura had uploaded the documents from her email. They had created a paper trail just clean enough to pass a lazy review, but sloppy enough to reveal what it was if someone looked closely. Not just a mistake. Not confusion. Collusion. I sat at the desk for a long time, staring at the neat rows of figures, the timestamps, the emails. My tea had gone cold. They'd been moving money in small amounts. $1,000 here. $2,000 there. Enough to go unnoticed at first glance. Always labeled as early tuition allocation or authorized support. When I closed the file, I felt quiet. Not surprised. Just tired. I thought back to the days when I braided Laura's hair before church, when I taught Owen to tie a tie before his 8th grade dance. I had watched them grow up. I had patched their scraped knees, mended their backpacks, stood in for a mother who had left them without a word. And now, they had chosen to erase me. Not with malice. With indifference. That was the hardest part. They didn't hate me. They didn't resent me. They simply no longer saw me as someone worth respecting. I was an obstacle. A step on the staircase they believed they had already climbed. I didn't cry. I folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the room Frank and I had shared for nearly 20 years. His slippers still sat beneath the dresser. His glasses were still on the nightstand. I hadn't touched them. I whispered aloud, "You were right to be cautious." Because Frank had warned me, in small ways. He had once refused to add Owen as a joint signer on the home equity account. He had said, "Not because I don't love him, but because I know what people can become when they feel entitled." I hadn't understood it then. I do now. I made a list the next day. Names. Documents. Accounts. I began moving funds. I called our lawyer again. I froze access to the education trust and initiated a full audit. Quietly, carefully. No announcements. They didn't notice at first. It was the Tuesday after Thanksgiving when Laura called. The house was quiet. I had spent the morning organizing winter linens, the kind of domestic task that fills time when no one else does. I was folding a flannel sheet when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Her voice was calm. Friendly, on the surface. She asked how I was, how the holiday had gone. I told her it was fine. She didn't ask who I'd spent it with. After a pause, she said she and Owen had been talking. "We were thinking," she said, "maybe it's time to start looking into assisted living options. Just, to be prepared. Nothing urgent. Just thinking ahead." I let her speak. She mentioned how much responsibility it was to maintain a house. How isolating it could be. She brought up safety. Community. A chance for me to be around people your age. She said it kindly, as if she believed it was an act of care. But I knew what it was. It wasn't about my safety. It was about control. She ended by saying they could help research places nearby. Places with resources, she said. Resources, as if I were a case to be managed. Not a woman who had raised them. Not a person whose name was still on every title and account. After the call, I didn't get angry. I didn't cry. I finished folding the sheet, placed it in the drawer, and went downstairs. I made tea. Sat at the kitchen table. Opened a blank notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Reclaiming myself. Then I wrote a list. The first name was Owen. The second was Laura. Over the next several days, I reviewed every financial record I had. Every account, every trust document, every signature. I called Miriam Blass and scheduled a full review. She remembered me. We met in her office. I brought a box of files and told her I wanted to start fresh. New will. New directives. New structure. Nothing shared. No co-signers. No beneficiaries who hadn't earned their place. We went through everything line by line. The trust for the grandchildren was the most important. Frank and I had agreed on that early. That money wasn't for our children, it was for theirs. Education, stability, a future without strings attached. But they had made it into something else. A source. A lever. So I froze the trust. Initiated an audit. Redirected all communication through Miriam's office. I opened new accounts. Moved funds. Changed passwords. Transferred assets into a trust under a different name. I hired a second lawyer, independent of anyone Frank had ever worked with, to oversee the transition. He asked if there were risks. I said there were people who believed they had access to things that never belonged to them. He understood. At the same time, I began preparing to leave the house. Frank had loved that house. We'd picked it together. Planted the garden ourselves. I had tried to love it after he was gone, but it had become too large, too full of absence. Too easy for others to use as a reason to insert themselves, checking in, offering help, suggesting I couldn't manage. I contacted a real estate agent quietly. The house was appraised, photographed, listed. I didn't tell anyone. The buyers were a retired couple from out of town. They liked the garden. Said they wanted a place to settle into without making changes. I signed the papers, accepted the offer, and scheduled the closing. The day I packed, no one called. I wrapped dishes in newspaper, sorted through drawers, gave away furniture. I kept only what mattered, my books, some letters, a few photographs, Frank's old radio. Everything else I let go. I moved into a 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of town. Simple. Clean. Mine. I didn't share the address. There, in that small quiet house, I allowed myself to stop waiting for things to improve. Each evening, I made tea and sat by the window. I didn't think about betrayal. I thought about distance. About how it gives you space to see clearly. They hadn't called because they hadn't noticed I was gone. And that told me everything. 3 weeks after the trust was frozen, Owen called. He asked about a tuition transfer that hadn't gone through. Said the school needed confirmation of payment. I told him there had been changes. What kind of changes? Legal changes, I said. Structural. A pause. You should have let us know. I didn't need to. He hesitated, then said something about the importance of communication. I told him I was handling it. That was the end of the call. Laura left a voicemail the next day. Her tone was lighter, almost rehearsed. She said she hoped everything was okay, that perhaps there'd been some misunderstanding. She said they loved me. I deleted it. This wasn't about misunderstandings. It was about boundaries. And mine had finally been drawn. A week later, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. Heavy stock, gold lettering. A formal invitation to Christmas Eve dinner. Addressed to Mrs. Margaret Whittaker. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just my name. There was no handwritten note. No personal message. A few days later, Laura sent a text. Just checking if you received the invitation. Should we count you in? I replied, yes. That night, I gathered the documents. 7 envelopes. Labeled with names. Inside, records, correspondence, account statements, audit findings, copies of the new legal documents. Nothing emotional. Nothing unprovable. Just what they had earned. I placed them in my bag. Not to start a fight. To end a pattern. I arrived at Owen and Laura's house just before 6. The walkway had been freshly salted. There were pine branches lining the porch railing, strung with soft white lights. A small wreath hung on the door, tasteful, symmetrical, expensive. The same house I had helped them buy. I remembered the day they signed the deed. Owen hadn't looked me in the eye when I handed him the check for the down payment. That should have meant something, even then. Laura opened the door. She looked surprised but recovered quickly. You made it, she said. I nodded, stepped inside. She didn't offer to take my coat. The house smelled of cinnamon, rosemary, and the sharp edge of red wine. There were at least 20 guests. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Children were weaving between legs and furniture, holding candy canes and plastic toys. Owen stood by the fireplace, talking to a man in a dark suit. He looked over when I entered, gave a brief wave, then went back to his conversation. There were name tags on the buffet table. Small place cards at the dining table. None of them had my name. No one looked at me twice. I had become, even here, an extra. A detail in the background. I sat in the armchair near the far wall. The one beside the window, half in shadow. From there, I watched everything, Laura's nervous glances toward the kitchen, Owen adjusting the stereo volume, the children running upstairs despite being told not to. I waited. When most guests had arrived and dinner was almost ready, I stood up. Quietly, deliberately. I walked to the center of the room and set my handbag on the coffee table. 7 envelopes. I placed each one carefully, side by side, in a neat row. Then I looked at Owen. "These are for you," I said. "For you and your sister. And whoever else needs clarity." He looked confused at first. Then irritated. "What is this?" "Documentation," I said. "Copies. Of everything." Laura stepped closer. "Margaret, what is this about?" I didn't answer. I wasn't there for a discussion. They opened them in front of everyone. The room didn't go silent all at once. It was more gradual, conversations slowing, glances shifting, voices dipping into awkward quiet. The sound of paper being unfolded. Pages turned. Owen read the first few lines of his letter, then stopped. He looked at me. "This isn't accurate," he said. "It's a direct copy of the account activity," I replied. "Including your authorizations." "I never," he started. "There are email records," I said. "The original PDF with your edits. The forwarding logs from Laura's address. I've included the timestamp history. And copies of the new trust structure. Everything's notarized." Someone coughed. Laura stepped back from the coffee table. She looked pale. Owen shook his head. "You're making a scene." "I haven't raised my voice," I said. "I haven't insulted anyone. I've brought facts. That's all." One of the envelopes contained the signed affidavit from Miriam, confirming the audit results. Another held the letter from the second attorney, outlining the legal transfer of authority. The remaining 5 contained the breakdown of the trust history and a brief summary of the documents now filed with the county office. "I've also removed your access to the account," I said. "Effective 3 weeks ago. And updated the power of attorney filings. You no longer appear on any of them." Owen turned toward his wife. She didn't say anything. A man near the dining room, someone I didn't know, asked quietly if this was a good time. Laura didn't answer. Several guests had already started to drift toward the front door. I remained where I was. "This wasn't meant to embarrass you," I said. "It's just the final step. I thought you should be told in person." "You could have called," Laura said. "I've spent the last decade calling," I replied. No one answered. They didn't argue after that. No one raised their voice. There were no accusations, no shouting. Just an unease that spread from one person to the next. I walked back to the armchair, picked up my coat, and slipped it over my shoulders. No one moved to stop me. At the door, I turned to look at the room one last time. Not for sentiment. Just to see it. To remember it clearly. "I won't be returning," I said. This was closure. Then I left. The cold outside was clean. The air had that sharp, bracing feel it gets when snow is coming. I walked down the front steps without looking back. My car was parked 3 houses away. I liked it that way. The distance helped. When I got home, I made tea and sat by the window. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. And that was enough. They didn't call that night. Not Laura. Not Owen. Not anyone else in that house. I sat in my small living room with the fire burning low, the sound of the wind moving along the eaves. The envelopes were gone. My part was done. There was no triumph in it. I wasn't waiting for apologies or explanations. I knew the silence that followed would not come from regret, but from confusion. And control slipping through their fingers. That was the part they never saw clearly. They believed I could be managed. That I'd stay quiet, dependable, grateful. That I wouldn't step outside the role they'd assigned me, caregiver, bank account, background presence. But I had rewritten those terms. And now, they were left to understand the cost. Laura was the first to reach out. The next morning, she sent a text, "Can we talk?" I didn't reply. An hour later, another, "You could have just asked us if something was wrong." I didn't need to ask. I had already seen enough. In the days that followed, there were more messages, some measured, some sharp. One from Owen read, "This was completely unnecessary. You made it worse than it ever had to be." He didn't ask what I wanted. He didn't ask why I had acted. He only accused. I didn't reply to him either. Eventually, Laura tried calling. The first time, she let it ring. The second, she left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, but controlled. She said she felt blindsided, that it would have been more respectful to discuss things privately. She said it wasn't fair to humiliate us in front of guests. Humiliation. That was what concerned her. Not the forgery. Not the withdrawals. Not the months of silent entitlement. Just the optics. She ended the message by saying she hoped we could work through this. There was nothing to work through. The work had already been done. I listened to the voicemail once, then deleted it. For 2 days, the calls stopped. Then Owen sent a longer message, a carefully written email this time. He acknowledged some decisions had been made without full transparency. He said there had clearly been misunderstandings, and that the family deserved a chance to clarify intentions. Intentions. That word again. As if actions could be washed away with the right phrasing. I didn't respond. Instead, I contacted Miriam and asked her to confirm that all final paperwork had been recorded. She said yes. Everything had been filed. Everything was secure. There was nothing left for them to adjust. On the third day, my granddaughter Sarah showed up at my door. She stood on the porch with her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes shifting between nervous and uncertain. She asked if she could come in. I opened the door. She sat at the kitchen table and said she hadn't known anything. That her father never told her about the trust, the transfers, or the changes. That she'd always thought the money came from some family fund, not something structured for their future. She asked me what had happened. I didn't tell her everything. I told her only what mattered. That trust was created to protect your future. Not to serve your parents' present. She looked down at the table. Is it gone now? No, I said. It's still there. But it's under different protection. It'll be there when you're ready for it. If you need it. And only if it's earned. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just nodded. I don't want to lose you, she said quietly. You haven't, I told her. But things have changed. She sat with me for a while longer. We had tea. She helped me bring in a small box from the porch that the postman had left behind. Then she left. No one else came. Owen didn't try again. Laura stopped sending messages. By the end of the week, the noise had died down completely. It was a silence different from the one I'd known before. Not absence. Not rejection. Just a gap they didn't know how to cross anymore. They were used to holding power, quiet, informal power over the woman who kept giving, without asking. They didn't know how to function when that power was gone. They would adjust. Or they wouldn't. Either way, I was no longer part of their calculations. It was strange, at first, waking up and knowing that I didn't owe anyone explanations. That no one could ask for access to what I had built. That no one could speak on my behalf or make decisions in my name. But then it became something else. Relief. Not freedom in the loud, triumphant sense. Just stillness. I started taking morning walks again. I went to the library twice a week. I made lentil soup and froze it in small batches, just for myself. I mended an old quilt. I lit a fire at night and read. The house stayed quiet. Clean. Undisturbed. Sometimes I thought of Frank, not in grief, but with a kind of steady recognition. He would have understood what I'd done. He had warned me, in small ways. He had always been careful, even when I wasn't ready to see why. I saw it now. I didn't hate them. I just couldn't trust them anymore. And that distinction made all the difference. I didn't announce my departure from the family. There was no letter, no explanation. I simply stopped participating in a version of my life that had long since stopped recognizing me. Once the documents were delivered and the silence settled in, I moved forward in a way that didn't require anyone else's permission. I spent the following week at a small inn 2 towns over. It overlooked a frozen lake. The rooms were plain, with heavy quilts and thick windows that kept the cold out. No one there knew me. I was checked in under my own name, and that was all anyone needed. I brought 1 suitcase, 2 books, and a folder of documents I didn't open once while I was there. I didn't go to clear my mind or make peace with the past. I went because I needed distance from the noise that had followed me for years, constant requests, subtle expectations, the ongoing assumption that I would never break away. At the inn, I spent most mornings by the window, watching birds settle on the snow-covered dock. I went for short walks when the wind allowed. In the afternoons, I read. I ate dinner early, alone, in the quiet dining room where no one asked questions. There were no calls. No texts. Nothing from Owen or Laura. I had expected as much. By the time I returned home, the cottage was just as I'd left it, still, clean, undisturbed. I unpacked slowly, put the books back on their shelf, and placed my folder in the locked drawer where I now kept all important documents. That first evening, I made soup and ate at the kitchen table with the window open slightly, just enough to hear the wind. The weeks that followed passed without complication. I began going to the library twice a week to volunteer, mostly shelving, sometimes organizing. I didn't speak much, but the women there were polite, and I liked the rhythm of the work. They never asked about my family. I never brought it up. No one else came to the door. No surprise visits. No mailed letters. Only 1 small envelope arrived in late January, postmarked from their town, with no return address. Inside was a photo. It was Sarah, my granddaughter, standing in front of a college dormitory, holding up her student ID. There was no note. I placed the photo on the shelf beside Frank's pocket watch. I didn't send anything back. I didn't need to. She knew where I was. I didn't try to rebuild a new version of the old relationships. I didn't reach out to explain my choices or defend them. The people who had taken advantage of my trust had already shown me how they measured value, and it wasn't through honesty or respect. Trying to fix that would have meant returning to a role I no longer accepted. Instead, I focused on my days. I kept the cottage tidy. I cooked for 1. I repaired a few old clothes I hadn't worn in years and gave away the things I no longer needed. Sometimes I walked by the lake just outside town. Other times, I stayed in and organized drawers or went through papers I hadn't touched in a decade. My life had become quiet, but not empty. I didn't feel regret. And I didn't feel proud. I felt steady. Once, I might have mistaken this for loneliness. But that would be giving too much weight to what had been taken from me, and not enough to what I had reclaimed. There's a kind of calm that follows when you've stopped negotiating your worth with people who always assumed it would come for free. I had learned that lesson later than I'd like to admit. But I had learned it. I thought of Frank sometimes, not in sadness, but in recognition. He would have approved of what I'd done. He had understood limits, even when I didn't. He had been more cautious than me. I used to see that as coldness. Now, I saw it as clarity. I kept his files neatly labeled. His letters in order. His memory intact. When I needed to hear a familiar voice, I read one of his old notes. They were simple. Often no more than a few lines. But they had weight. They reminded me who I was before the silence began to close in around me. No one from the family ever followed up. There were no apologies. No explanations. Just a clean break. And that, in the end, was easier to live with than any half-hearted attempt at reconciliation. They would tell their version of what happened. To their friends, their children, maybe even to each other. It would sound different than the truth, because it had to. People rarely speak honestly about the choices that cost them something they never believed they could lose. I didn't mind. Their version belonged to them. Mine was complete. I didn't need closure in words. I had found it in action, in the firm boundary drawn, the decisions made carefully and without emotion. I had protected what was mine, not because it was valuable to them, but because it had always been mine to protect. What comes next is simple. I will continue to live quietly. On my terms. I will make soup when I want. I will sit by the window when the wind moves through the trees. I will open a new book when the last one ends. I will keep a place for Sarah, should she ever wish to know me beyond the stories told by others. But I will never again ask to be included. I will never again explain why I said no. And I will never again give pieces of myself in exchange for proximity. That part of my life is over. What remains is steady. Clean. Mine.